Howdy folks, I'm Southern Wolf of the Southern Wolf Studios. Welcome back to Samurai of Hyuga. Now I've decided that at the beginning of each of these episodes from now on, I'm going to show you the stats that we have accumulated through our journey. We have a strong leaning towards calculative, a slight leaning towards perverted, a perfect 50-50 mix between charming and stoic, a slight leaning towards protective, and a strong leaning towards finesse. Chapter 5. Forgotten People. I stripped my orange Harori off and tossed it to the ground. It was a sweat-stained heap of unnecessary clothing I didn't want on me anymore. This was something I wanted to do ever since I entered the stagnant lion temple, where the air stood still and humid. It was no longer any need to maintain my appearance with the Emperor gone. But when he left, all the adrenaline I had went with him. Fatigue fell over me like a barbed net. My body wanted me to believe that keeping still was the safest move. It wasn't. The morning sun began to peek out into the bell-shaped windows. Those its frame cast shadows of bars over me. It reminded me of a jail cell, a luxury I could only hope the Yamato City Watch could spare me after our last encounter. I spared the mustachioed man his life, but I had enough life experience to know no good deed went unpunished. I couldn't expect fair treatment from these well-paid goons, especially not since I was a family-less ronin from out of town. And while Mitsumi had one of the most powerful names outside of the royal family, they knew what she was. Someone who could blow a tornado inside a tea house. A shingenja who wasn't controlled by the military. At least she was too valuable to risk harming. Not a bad fact to keep in mind, but I still couldn't get careless. Mitsumi and I needed to get out of this death trap of a capital city. After that, we would worry about hunting Satsuma's spirits. I wasn't sure if they even existed, and I was even less sure of the Kunoichi who was staring me down. That's right, Toshi and I needed to talk. Toshi. That's a name I've heard a lot lately. Toshi. That's a name I've heard a lot lately. It was the name of the bride-to-be that ruined a perfectly good evening of drinking sake. All I had to worry about back then was Mitsumi's endless stream of complaints, a far cry from this vast spiritual undertaking. It didn't matter how pleasant the Emperor was about it, or how noble the cause was, it was still a pirate fleet full of trouble. The masked Kunoichi nodded. You're right. We first met back in the inn. I had to test you. The Emperor, he trusts too easily. With her shoulders square and her arms crossed, it was safe to say the ninja didn't share this trust problem. Her body language was far from friendly, which was good, because I was about to get unfriendly, and fast. Yeah, well, the lack of trust is mutual. I took a moment to crack my neck. Mostly because I like to think it intimidates people. Why should I throw in with a ninja who's already tricked me once before? My voice wasn't loud, not yet, but it grew with each passing word. Among many other things, I hated playing the fool for someone else's scheme. Double-cross me? Sure. I could understand the idea behind keeping an assassin quiet. But to trick me into believing that I was saving a fiancé from a human trafficking ploy, when someone took advantage of my rarely revealed good nature, I couldn't help but getting rubbed the wrong way. If I thought my words wouldn't get Toshi to back down, I was wrong. She raised a clenched fist and took a step forward, but it was what she said that made my blood boil. What I do know is that you're a ronin, a master as a swordsman expertly trained. I saw you draw your blade back there, with your balancing act, but it wasn't some parlor trick. A look of anger, or perhaps even fear, flashed across the ninja's face. No hesitation. Swordsmanship at such a level? I don't even know what you are, but I know you're dangerous, both to yourself and the girl. An unpleasant pain jolted down my spine as she said, "Endanger the kid." The words cut me like hunger did a fat man. It hurt deeper than it showed. The reason it stung so bad wasn't because it was bullshit, but just the opposite. The truth in her remark shook me to the core. Calculative. I had thought about rushing her, but only for a moment. Instead, I let my hand hover over my katana's hilt, and my legs adjusted themselves into a ready position. If she was a ninja worthy of the Emperor's confidence, she would be skilled enough to dodge my counter and directly attack. But I wouldn't mind putting that theory to a test. Are you forgetting? I gazed into those eyes with a fire that threatened to set aflame this temple. I'm dangerous to you, too. In a graceful voice, but with graceless anger, the kid intervened. Quiet, both of you! His Imperial Majesty has entrusted all of us with this divine quest! Sumi planted her hands at her side and looked at like a disgusted parent chasing down a couple of brats. Talk about a role reversal.
Can't you act civilized for once?
Let my hand relax and return away from the hilt of my katana. My feelings hadn't changed, but the kid had a point. Now just wasn't the time. My first job is still your protection. Protective has increased. My first job is still your protection. It didn't matter if this was some epic journey that the Emperor had dreamt up. I was still the kid's bodyguard, that hadn't changed, and I added, fighting spiritual ghosts and cataclysmic affairs, well, I shook my head at the ridiculousness of it all. Sounds a bit counterproductive to keeping you safe. Bringing Mitsumi along on this quest was akin to cramming her into a hay barrel, drenching her in lamp oil, and rolling her down the inner slopes of Mount Yoshinori, an active volcano up north. The imagery may be a bit overdone, but the point stands. A point Mitsumi deflected with her personal brand of unyielding stubbornness.
Well, I'm undertaking this quest regardless, so I suppose you'll have no choice but to accompany me.
Even as a meager candlelight, I could have sworn I spotted a miniature smirk across the Shingenja's face. Just what was she so pleased about was another matter. I felt like I was wrapped around her delicate little finger. Great. I could hear the Kunoichi sigh. Even beneath the mask she was wearing, her body relaxed into almost a slump. Let's set aside our differences for now. We should be on the Eastern Pay by noon if we aren't impeded. Toshi nodded in a respectful gesture. It's important that we start this off on the right foot. I scratched the back of my head in embarrassment. Yeah, about that. The front entrance of the Lion Temple roared open with the screeching of broken wood. Nearly a dozen men decked in armor flooded in like a rhinoceros stampede. Spear in one hand, lantern in the other. The Yamato City Watch had arrived. Heavy breathing and the stench of sweat permeated through the once peaceful chamber of the Lion Temple. These men had sprinted their way across half the capital to get here, wearing 100 pounds of gear apiece. No easy task, especially for stationary guards in what had been the most peaceful place in Hyuga. If they were smart, they'd have this place surrounded. But if they were smart, they would have waited to catch their prey before entering. I looked over towards Mitsumi, who was frozen in place, and then Toshi, who was nowhere to be found. She had probably cloaked herself into the darkness upstairs, leaving the two of us to face this peril. Damn, I hate working with ninjas. I could hear murmuring in the crowded guardsmen between their heart-pounding gasps for air. Shingenja. Apparently, word of Mitsumi's little trick had gotten out, though it might not be a bad thing. They were keeping more than a little respectful distance from the kid, which made my job a lot easier. One of my jobs, anyway. The silence was starting to make me uncomfortable. Atop that, my wrist itched something awful. Part of me was just waiting for an excuse to let loose. The other wanted me to give them a good warning. No one needs to die here. No one needs to die here. These men were settled soldiers. They had wives and maybe a kid or two. Maybe they were on their way out of the military, or maybe they couldn't enlist in the first place. Whatever the case is, it didn't sit well with me to kill them. No one deserved to die from a nameless ronin, but that didn't stop their ringleader from stepping forward. He had the most annoying grin on his face, but that wasn't what made him so familiar. The unmistakably long and stupid-looking mustache was unforgettable. As if to drive the point of his annoying presence further, he twisted the hairy tendrils with his fingers. You know, Ronin, I get a discount for each visitor I send towards the esteemed scholar. You could have saved me some money. The veteran watchman pulled at his mustache almost as if to tear the whole thing off. It was a shame that he didn't. Though I reckon we'll be making a good bit of row putting down this one. Right, boys? With the crowd successfully roused, I prepared for combat. I also cracked a smile. Couldn't help it. This Ronin rubbed shoulders with the Emperor himself. These second-rate soldiers would be lucky if they ever caught wind of the man. I didn't know how to fight spirits, but these guys I could handle. A younger man charged out at me. With his eyes equal in fear and determination, it was a look I had seen countless times before. It was a look that stuck on their faces after their breathing ceased, and their muscles stiffened.
The time for talking was over.
Attempt to blind him. While the recruit charged at me blindly, in a sense. Even a novelist could land a lucky strike. Just like these were best to minimize whenever possible. Although the distance between us closed rapidly, I couldn't help but notice the weapon at my feet, the orange Hirori jacket that the Oyamas had kindly given me. Not only was it a perfect fit, it was a perfect diversion. I swung my leg down hard enough to make any martial artist proud, into a mound of damp clothing. It sprawled outward like a brightly colored net in my opponent's face. His spear point dropped down towards my feet, though with his momentum he still threatened to rush me over. So I had to get fancy. I planted my sandals down on the tip of the spear. Wedging it into the floorboard, I only had an instant, enough time to bring my other leg up and curl it back. I made sure to put my knee right in his path, en route where the recruit's face was about to be. The force of the collision flung the guard's feet out from underneath him, turning his body into a plank that slammed against the hardwood floor head first. He was lucky to be wearing a helmet. I checked over towards Mitsumi to make sure that she was still there. Her wits had returned to her as she made for the stairs to the loft above. It was certainly safer than staying down here, but the movement attracted attention. Several armored guards darted after the kid, but they wouldn't reach her if I could help it. Pull out the mat. My hands clutched like talons around the edge of the mat. I had waited a second before the kid was clear of it. Even if my timing was perfect, there was no guarantee this would work. But my life had never had many guarantees. Spirits helped me. I nearly threw out my back, pulling the rug underneath them. The three pursuers, guards with sedimentary lifestyles, had an obvious fondness for desserts over vegetables. On top of that, they were each armored, but that only made their collapse all the more painful. They tripped and toppled over one another and then clambered into a metal heap. I surprised myself at how non-lethal my methods were. Usually I just went for the throat. Had Mitsumi's words back there at the Kabuki Theater changed something? That was an uncomfortable thought, one I didn't have time to speculate. My nose told me that there was smoke, and my eyes, which started to water, persuaded me to believe it. A light emerged from the end of the tatami mat I was still holding. The rice straw made for makeshift tinder, which spread fire like disease through a whorehouse. Disgustingly quick. The lanterns the guards were carrying had fallen and broken, spilling and bellowing into a bonfire. Things were really heating up in the lion's den. I heard a voice from the shadows above, beckoning me to hurry. "Okami-san, get up here!" Toshi's tone was hardly quiet for a ninja, and instead echoed against the chamber's walls. But I only needed to be told once. My feet darted up the staircase in a bumbling hurry. I nearly tripped twice on my way up. I couldn't see my own hand in front of me, but that wasn't why I was struggling. There weren't many two-story buildings where I was from. Not that I was afraid of heights, of course. I just didn't feel right being up this high. Smoke followed me to the upstairs loft. I bumped into something, or rather someone. A warm someone whose height and curves could only belong to the Kunoichi. But where's the kid? A blissfully cool breeze brought my attention towards a bell-shaped window, whose bars were unceremoniously ripped apart. Natsumi was on the other side, struggling to keep her balance atop the sloping roof. Clay tiles required dexterous toes, otherwise you'd slide right off the curve. I followed Toshi out with the yells of fire and ronin close behind. From this vantage point, I could confirm my earlier fears. The Lion Temple was surrounded by a dozen additional guardsmen, who idled about anxiously due to the commotion coming from within. I just hoped they wouldn't look up.
Hooah!
The undersized Shingenja tripped against her full-length kimono at the worst possible time. I was too far away to grab her. She was going to tumble right off, right into the sentry's clutches. I had failed. Careful, Hashimoto-san. These shingles catch upon loose clothing easily. I let out a breath of air I didn't realize I was holding in. Toshi managed to grab a hold of the kid at the last possible moment, but my relief didn't last long. The lookouts below yelled up at us. So much for a covert escape. The voices in the temple grew ever closer. I looked at the building nearby. Temples nearly identical to this one. And I knew what I had to do. With more than one look at the paved cobblestone 20 feet below, I gulped and sealed my courage. I've been in countless situations more fearsome and fatal than this. Mitsumi struggled to maintain her balance, and it became obvious she wouldn't be able to pull off the acrobatics I needed her to. So I decided to take matters in my own hands and carried her myself. Bridal style in my arms. Unceremoniously, I picked up my employer, one hand at her back, the other just below her knees. This was the style that glorified samurai used to carry maidens off in stories. Mitsumi would have to settle for a ronin.
Let me down at once! This brashness is borderline vulgar!
She flailed in my arms.
But this was nothing compared to a giant koi I wrestled down just hours ago. Deal with it, kid. Unless those short legs of yours can vault a 10-foot gap, I'll handle this. While I said it with my typical self-confidence, I was anything but. Visibility was poorer than a one-fingered pickpocket. The nearby rooftops looked deceivingly close. I strengthened my hold on the kid as if she was going to fly off in the next breeze. I wouldn't admit how glad I was when Toshi spoke up. "Okami-san, I believe I know of a route where we can lose our pursuers." The blue-garbed ninja had turned away from me, and I couldn't help but detect some hesitation in her voice. My shoulders were already starting to ache from Mitsumi's tendencies towards sweet rolls. I didn't have time to hesitate. You know this place better than I do. Calculative has increased. You know this place better than I do. At least I hope she did, for all our sakes. Everything I had learned during my stay in Yamato thus far, I'd be trying to forget in the upcoming weeks, assuming I lived that long. The Lion Temple roared beneath us in what sounded more like a frightened wail than a furious rage. The roof tilted ever so slightly backwards. The supports beneath us were starting to fail. Although my reluctant maiden I was carrying had quieted down, those guards were raising an uproar. We didn't have time to shoot the breeze. We were lucky enough not to be shot at. I was confident with my hold over Mitsumi, but with neither of my hands free, I wasn't going to be a factor in a fight. At least I could keep up the pace with the kunoichi. And then Toshi fell off the edge. My pace tapered off considerably. What the hell was she thinking? If I hit the ground from this high up, I'd sure break a leg. Even though if I did, Mitsumi could still make a run for it. She lacked all manner of common sense, but she'd be able to sneak out of here on her own. Maybe. Jump down. Protective has greatly increased. I whispered an order, but it sounded more like a prayer. Kid, hold on tight. Her soft and delicate hands tightened behind my neck. Mitsumi's face turned toward my chest, away from the dangerous stunt I was about to pull. I tried not to think about the hurried breathing I now felt against me. I just had to make sure that once I hit the ground, I fell backwards, not forwards. With greater speed and balance than most men could boast, I ran down the path Toshi had taken. In fearlessness, I jumped off. And in stupidity, I only realized that there was another set of rafters below this one. We hit it with a thud and then slid off the curve with the gracefulness of a tailless monkey. We may have been apes, but at least we weren't injured. Toshi stood beside us in silence, and for once I'm glad the mask hid her expression. When a looming shadow grew over me, I yanked Mitsumi up and ran. Behind me was a cloud of smoke and dust and screams. The Lion Temple collapsed atop its prey. The shrine, ages old, burned to the ground. What a fitting start to our spiritual journey. And so we ran. We ran with Toshi as our guide down the streets that grew filthier at every corner. This particular alleyway was of the dark variety. Even with the sun dawned in the sky, the thatched roofs were not tall but long, providing shade that hid the streets from above. Perhaps this was intentionally so. We were in an area of the city that disguised itself from ever existed, like a ward on the beautiful, maintained body of a kabuki actress. The condo ghettos, both familiar to me and at the same time foreign. I found it a tad unnerving, to say the least. Having been born and raised in districts destitute, it was a hard surprise to see a body or two sprawled out, breathing or perhaps otherwise. But it was the contrast that shook me. From orderly orchards and white-painted geishas to mounds of trash and figures that blended in at night. Those figures had now surrounded us. They moved around us in fear, uncertain of the three who had invaded their territory so carelessly. If we came from the lion's den, then we have entered the panther's lair. Every beast had eyes set on my weapon, my symbol of absolute authority. Every step I made, I questioned why Toshi had taken us this way in the first place. But it wasn't my words that broke the oppressive silence, but the words from a kid, in a weak utterance.
Okami, where are we? Are we still in Yamato?
Fear didn't just drip from Mitsumi's voice, it drenched it. How could I blame her when even a rough and ronin such as myself grew uneasy? I looked towards Toshi for an answer, but there wasn't one. I was starting to doubt this was a plan either. Specifically, I planned to get out of this forsaken capital. I didn't know whose company I disliked more, the city's watch or these dark-skinned slummers. But I did know I wanted the countryside immediately. You know, fresh air, a pleasant lack of other humans. Nature and I were hardly at peace with each other, but at least I didn't have to worry about her shanking me in the back. Don't. I only draw my blade when I intend on using it. While it was difficult to imagine, I already had my quota of fights for one evening. And this evening dragged on long. When was the last time I was able to catch my breath, much less catch some sleep? I'd yawn if I weren't so concerned about provoking an attack. Toshi's feet paused in a sudden halt. I stopped as well, but I wasn't happy about it. Every second we stayed in this filth-ridden slum was another second of danger. I needed to get myself and the kid out of here. Right as I was about to ask, Toshi handed a rose to her neck. It was a weird gesture until I realized what she was doing. She took off her mask and the familiar locks of black hair fell against her shoulders. I felt like I did back then beside the fattened Oyamas and their impossibly beautiful daughter. But then she turned around and my mind shattered. Toshi was one of them? The murmurs and accents from the growing crowd formed a strange sort of unison. Toshi-sama was a reoccurring name I managed to catch. They flocked as close to the ninja as their courage allowed, as close as they dared guess at their range of my katana was. But the children didn't hold such qualms and rushed to hug Toshi's legs. We're safe here, Okami-san. Her skin that once been powdered pale was now sun-ripened, an almost bronze coating on her feminine features. It was amazing what makeup could hide. It all makes sense now. The sharp-nosed pair with the high cheekbones, those unmistakably sultry lips, the dark green eyes no Hyugan had, generous childbearing hips, a Kondo native through and through. I felt my mind race around like a spindle that spun faster and tighter every turn. The dizziness starting to make me sick. My stomach threatened to turn itself inside out. Was the woman standing before me the same that I met at the Sleeping Duck? The way she had acted, the authority she held, there was no way. I know what I look like, what I am. Toshi's olive-colored eyes darted towards the ground. The dirt and grime we stood upon was solid evidence of the bright cobblestone street we had left behind. No guardsman would ever dare venture here and leave his sandals unwashed afterwards. Toshi's words continue grave as the expression on her face. I was hoping to earn some measure of trust before revealing myself to you two. The quiet and modesty was a stark difference from the pride I was used to hearing from the Kunoichi's voice. Or was it Toshi who stood shoulder to shoulder with the Emperor? One deceit after another? How can I travel with someone I can't even trust? Stoic has increased. One deceit after another. How can I travel with someone I can't even trust? While the hero's welcome was a huge improvement from the atmosphere before, my nerves were far from settled. Too many questions and not enough answers, the most relevant of which was this one. We had a huge journey ahead of us, a task dangerous enough on its own accord. Toshi was a risk that we just couldn't afford to take. She bowed her head again. I understand your feelings, but I owe everything to Satsuma-kun, and I will give my life to see that his will be done. I swear that to you, Okami-san. I shook my head. I had suspected it before, but now the dark-skinned Kunoichi had shown her hand, and I didn't like the cards I was seeing. A lowly Kondo dares call his Imperial Majesty in such a familiar fashion? I should cut you down where you stand, and would. Be grateful that I'm no longer a samurai. I wasn't honor-bound to the Emperor, Hyuga, or anything really, but this Kondo's casualness towards a man whose eyes I couldn't even meet, it angered me in ways I couldn't explain. It started to feel like this Kondo was better than me, and if that was the case, I could no longer look down on them as I had for so many years. And when you were a worthless orphan, you needed to look down on someone. Anyone. I cursed at myself for my own weakness, for having placed my trust in the kid's safety in Toshi's hands. The task ahead of us was dangerous enough without the risk of bringing one of them along. We wouldn't find lodging anywhere, not even a pile of hay. In some rural areas, condos were hunted for sport. We didn't need that kind of trouble. Mitsumi disagreed with me.
Lessen the force of your words, Okami.
Mitsumi tugged at my sleeve to steal my attention. Her face lit up with her voice raised, and I knew I was in for a history lesson.
This is my first encounter with Aboriginals, the people from whom us Hyugans displaced. The accounts differ from one historian to the next, though it can be inferred that Kondos have suffered greatly.
The fact that they were suffering wasn't surprising given the property value where we currently stood.
And although direct conflict ceased a century ago, their culture and language, their very identity, has been systematically destroyed. Finding any records of their past is impossible, as if history has forgotten them.
The Shingenja's voice choked up as her eyes started to water. It reminded me that she was just a scholar, but a hopeless romantic as well. Toshi bowed deeply and held her head down for a long moment before responding. Your words show a kindness I could not dare to hope for, Hashimoto-san. Sadly, you are absolutely correct. So much of what my people once were no longer exist. Hyugans call us Kondos, though we refer to ourselves as the Forgotten People. Perhaps it was the sun that rose in dramatic fashion behind her. Perhaps it was the bright smiles of the little ones that beamed up in sincere happiness. It made her look like a saint in ninja attire. And it made a hardened ronin like me start to regret what I said earlier. We were hunted by an entire city of samurai, burdened with an impossible quest, and walking dead from tiredness. But for a moment, all that didn't seem to matter.